I haven't paid ultra close attention to the executive orders. Some of my reporting in the lead up to his inauguration and also during the campaign, as it related to, the Trump camp in particular, are some of his connections to these big tech figures, whether it's Elon Musk or figures that are, also part of the so-called PayPal mafia, David Sachs being the crypto and AI czar, for example, and someone like J.D. Vance having relatively close proximity to Peter Thiel, someone at a top HHS position, Jim O'Neill, also very close to Peter Thiel, who has, I would argue, wildly different views than Robert F. Kennedy, who's supposed to lead HHS, especially in terms of deregulation, biotech, and mRNA technology. What are these things ultimately going to result in? And I would consider people to consider those connections and also consider that there's a high likelihood, just like in the first term, that there will be a lot of, deregulation over the next 4 years. And I'm sure a lot of people will be happy about that. But I think some people that voted for Trump may not be, particularly in the Make America Healthy Again movement, where deregulation at the FDA, for example, could result in a flooding of the market with mRNA products, which are very controversial with a significant segment of Trump's base, for example. Or when Trump was in office the first time, he deregulated biotech and agriculture pretty significantly. A lot of people in that same Make America Healthy Again movement are not really into, a proliferation of GMO crops in the food supply, for example. I think a lot has been said about, people have probably noticed Palantir's stock performance. I think it's very likely that over the next 4 years, Palantir will become an even more important government contractor, considering that a lot of people that are prominent Palantir investors or co-founders have attached themselves in various ways, either to the Trump campaign as donors or occupying important posts in the administration. So Palantir, again, is sort of the engine that a lot of the surveillance state really runs on. And I think people should really educate themselves about it, especially as it relates to predictive policing and predictive health and predicting pandemics before it happens, and all of that is concerning to you. And I think it's likely that there's going to be an increase in biometric digital ID. Trump has sort of marketed this as a way to stop mass migration. The dialectics are different, but it's sort of a policy that's being marketed all over the world. Depending on the country, the sales pitch is different, but ultimately that policy is being marketed, and in the push into digital assets, I think, is also happening globally. And I think Trump made it very clear that he was going to be very focused on that. And I don't think there's any reason to doubt that particular promise. I personally am of the view that there are oligarchs that are interested in king-making markets. I think that's particularly true of someone like David Sachs, who's going to be the crypto AI czar and doesn't have to divest from any of his investments or other potential conflicts of interest with some of the firms that he'll be involved in overseeing or deciding regulation on. And when you have that type of power, you can easily king-make and pick and choose companies that you want to see win. And so you kind of have to wonder if this is really going to be a free market type of situation, as a lot of people would like it to be, because when you have that type of centralized power sort of deciding who wins and who doesn't, and, having OpenAI and Oracle, for example, in this recent announcement, those are very big companies. They're likely to only get bigger should there be a more decentralized landscape in these industries that are so important to foster competition. Or are we getting close to a quasi-monopoly model in certain fields of big tech? And I think that could be potentially problematic and something to look at, especially when you consider that there have been, statements made by members of the quote-unquote PayPal mafia that free market competition is for losers and that companies should find a niche and corner that market and essentially build a monopoly or quasi-monopoly. And some of those people have done that in direct collaboration with the national security state, as is the case of Palantir, for example, which was, created with CIA and InQtel's direct involvement and has very significant CIA connections from its origins to now. So if you're building a quasi-monopoly and you don't like free market competition and you're going to partner, with most powerful and unaccountable parts of the state in that way, what does that ultimately mean? And is this, going to be the free market utopia that we're being sold, or, is something else going to happen? It's not really surprising to me that there's being a big push into AI infrastructure. And this is something that's really been what I would argue a bipartisan push that's been going on for some time, starting with really the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence that was led by Eric Schmidt. Even though he's a Democratic donor, has been very active in this space and sort of has the same view, propagated by more Republican-leaning big tech figures, that the U.S. needs to outcompete China in AI specifically. And some of the National Security Commission on AI comments and presentations they gave that have since been released through Freedom of Information Act requests essentially suggest that the roadmap to doing so is to impose lots of domestic surveillance and AI-powered surveillance technology on the American public as a way to sort of leapfrog China, because they argue that China has already done that and thus has a much larger user base and data set for all of these different AI technologies. And so in order to outdo them, we must drastically increase our user base of these AI technologies, which includes things like surveillance, facial recognition, expanding that, expanding e-commerce, reducing in-person shopping, and really in-person activities, including healthcare, in-person doctor visits, moving to telemedicine as much as possible. And this was really a big focus of that commission, which was the meeting of the national security state and the big tech industry in the years prior to COVID-19. And a lot of that push into the digital realm was a consequence of a lot of COVID-19 era policies that's helped sort of feed that ambition. But I think with this goal to have an increased, investment in AI infrastructure, we're likely to see that develop. And it's not really surprising that you have Larry Ellison of Oracle involved. He's recently had comments about the need for things like digital ID in the United States, which would be sort of a core foundational aspect of this type of wide-reaching AI system, and also said that basically, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but invasive AI surveillance systems on citizens will help them be on their best behavior, which is a rather Orwellian thing to say and sort of very much feeds into the idea of the panopticon, where if someone is always being watched, the panopticon, is used in the context of surveillance a lot, but it was originally a model for a prison where prisoners are always being watched, but they can't directly see the people watching them, and sort of induces obedience to be on their best behavior at all times. And I view that as kind of not necessarily positive trade-off between liberty and at least perceived security. I think people would do well to sort of interrogate some of the consequences of handing such a big AI infrastructure project to companies that are run by individuals with those views in particular. I would rather start with a paraphrase of a rather well-known quote of Benjamin Franklin's, which goes something along the lines of, those who trade their liberty for security ultimately have neither of those things. And I think there's a pretty clear indication, particularly over the past 20 plus years, the post 9/11 era, that, great surveillance powers, at least in the hands of the United States and most other governments in the world, frankly, are routinely abused for the purpose of silencing dissent, among other things that are not positive for liberty. And that you could argue that there are situations where insecurity is engineered in the public in order to facilitate people giving up their liberty or civil liberties in particular for what they perceive as an increased security, or they're told is increased security. And I don't really think that's necessarily always the case at the end of the day. And I think a lot of the mass surveillance system, as it was designed in the immediate post 9/11 era, was meant to rely a lot on sort of predictive paradigms. So what do I mean by that? Essentially things like what are now called predictive policing or predictive health. The idea that we can stop criminal activity or a terrorist attack before it happens by looking at certain data flows, for example. And the same was also posited in the post 9/11 era for stopping bioterror attacks before they happen and natural pandemics before they happen, which is also kind of a sticky issue because some of those proposals and their sort of resurrections in the post-COVID era, I think, are a little dubious because they sort of creating interventions, health interventions, before symptoms even show up in a particular population based on certain markers identified in AI and sewage water, for example, and things like that. So you're really putting a lot of trust in algorithms, and sometimes those algorithms are not as accurate as the company claims. And as far as I know, a lot of those claims are not independently vetted. So ultimately, it could, lead to some unfortunate consequences, I think, particularly if you're trying to prove in a pre-crime scenario that you weren't going to commit the crime. It's you versus the algorithm. And who do you think, the position of authority is likely to side with in those scenarios? I think it's kind of creates sticky situations. I sort of see the government as a public-private partnership. The public sector, because of political donations, among other things, is always very in tune to the concerns of the private sector. And a lot of the most powerful players in the private sector and in the financial sector are very interested in sort of de-risking the world as much as possible. And a lot of intelligence agencies sort of share that view. And so I think a lot of this surveillance and this predictive paradigms and all of that, a lot of it sort of comes down from their perspective, I think, to sort of de-risking the society and markets as well. So, if you want to take risk to zero that there will be crime in a particular area, the type of interventions you would have to impose would be pretty significant, right? It doesn't sound bad when you phrase it that way necessarily, and that's why I was phrasing it that way way because I think that's how these people in elite circles tend to think about it, ultimately, at the end of the day. If you're the CIA, for example, you don't really want to have to be more transparent and more accountable for things you have done in the past. I think that's been pretty clear with their history as an agency. But they'd be more interested in eliminating the risk for them that they would have to make those behavioral changes, I guess you could say, as an agency. So what would you do to prevent that kind of risk from happening? Would you manipulate the public sphere and the public discussion around the CIA to make those things unpopular? De-risking can take many forms, but I think these people generally tend to think of things in terms of risk to the activities they're doing, especially those that tend to be gray area or, potentially illegal.